for another edition of The Professional Dreamer, where the weird turn pro, but the dreamers tune in, turn on, and get busy. Hey, who wrote this script? Look, this is my world, and you're welcome to it, but I'm still the host. Oh, hello, I'm Jennifer Warren. Over the years, I've been asked to explain what makes America the deeply divided nation that it is today. But trying to answer without being interrupted or shouted at, well, that brought me to the point where, I have a bit of an axe to grind when the subject comes up. And one of the reasons I started my blog was to have my say in writing. The reason for the podcast is, that's just to have a little fun. Originally, I wanted to write and talk about how politics gets in the way of technological progress, but the insanity of Trump and his followers, let's just say it left me distracted. So, I'm going to try a new tactic. From now on, I'm going to talk about politics only until I reach a point where I have about half an excuse to talk about technology. It may not seem at first like there's a snowball's chance in hell of my getting there, but aiming for it's part of the fun. Will she make it? What happens if she doesn't? I'll tell you what happens. I get bored. I don't like bored. So I'm going to spend this episode trying to not be bored. So, let me think. I'll talk about how a war, 2 accidental presidents, and beer all combined to make Trump and his followers possible. Now, don't worry. I'll try to keep things interesting by pointing out how things might have been different if they had done things differently. Of course they would have. But we still face the same problems that they did. And the difference is we have better technology and new ideas to deal with those issues. We can learn from those mistakes because, as Santayana said, those who do not learn from the past are condemned to repeat it. I probably won't finish, but you've got to admit it's not a bad idea for a show. At least if you're an information junkie. So let's start with the 800-pound gorilla in the room, named Appomattox. I know you were never told what happened at the small, dusty Virginia Crossroads community of Appomattox Courthouse, but you really should have been. Because everything that happens in politics today is a direct result of the blunder that started at the Civil War and the dark aftermath of Appomattox. To understand it, you have to remember that 14 states had seceded from the United States to form what they called the Confederate States of America. That these were not very bright people should be obvious when you realize that the only difference between the meaning of Confederate States and United States is the spelling. If the fact that they did it to preserve the institution of slavery isn't enough to convince you how crazy they were, their constitution said that all 14 states had to unanimously agree on treaties, ambassadors, or any other business normal to a modern nation before anything could be done. 14 states? Unanimous agreement? Really? About everything? Seriously? I can't get 14 people to agree on lunch. Now, one thing they did agree on, though, was that they didn't want armed federal troops from another country in their territory. Countries are funny that way. Lincoln said that they didn't deserve to be a country, so he refused to remove them. The idea was that they would eventually get tired of asking nicely and turn to force. It took them nearly a year, but they got there. And when the South finally did fire on Fort Sumter, to remove the troops, Lincoln got what he wanted. He got Congress to vote for war. Now, Americans today believe that secession is illegal. It's not. The United States Supreme Court even said so in the case of Texas versus White. We're taught, though, that Lincoln had no other choice. That's not true either, because the Confederate Constitution was so draconian as to require unanimous votes. All Lincoln really had to do was to give the South exactly what they wanted, just once. Think about it. If he had removed all the federal troops, the armor, the equipment, the ammunition, powder, weaponry, everything that was the property of the United States government from the South, pulled it out to a point just outside of the Confederate borders, he would have effectively created the world's first embargo. If he had then used the time to shore up banking regulations and do away with the legal concept of corporate personhood, the South would have been prevented from, well, they would have been prevented from accessing their own resources outside their own border. And without the ability to import or export goods, the South would have collapsed within a generation. Instead, Lincoln chose a long and bloody civil war, a war that took over 1 million lives. The first major battle between the two great armies of the North and South took place in Virginia, on a farm owned by Wilmer McLean. The battle raged for days while the family went about their business inside their house, a house made of wood. When a Union shell finally exploded in his kitchen, Wilmer McLean decided that, well, maybe the neighborhood wasn't quite safe enough for his family anymore, so he moved to the community of Appomattox Courthouse, which was only a few miles outside of Richmond, Virginia. Nothing exciting ever happened there, so he figured that he was safe from ever being bothered by the war again. But 3.5 years later, Confederate General Lee surrendered to United States General Ulysses S. Grant, which meant that Wilmer McLean could rightfully say, "The war began in my front yard and ended in my living room." But when Lee surrendered, he told Grant that the war, the surrender, had resolved nothing, that the causes would appear again some other time and in some other form. But even though Lee was cordial in his surrender, his men were not. They vowed to continue the fight in any way possible. And when Lee's property was taken to build the National Cemetery of Arlington and Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, the groundwork was laid for a belief that the only thing the government does is steal property from hard-working people. The hatred against the government became a tradition that was passed down to children, along with the lie that the war had been fought over states' rights, not slavery. Songs like that old-time religion were sung in churches to remind everyone that blind acceptance was better than questioning the lies that their parents had told them about the war, slavery, and the government. Those lies are still believed at face value by Republicans today. But you know, it wasn't always so. Because, you see, Lincoln and Grant were Republicans. So were the majority of the members of both houses of Congress prior to the war. So the loyalty of the South wasn't given to Republicans, it was given to the Democrats. Democrats then and now were the party of working people. Their leaders were not people born with a silver spoon in their mouths, but, well, they were lucky to have utensils or even shoes. Because they were from the people, their values were no different than the people they represented. Naturally, that made them racist too. They rode with the Ku Klux Klan and even opposed the rights of women and minorities to sit at the same lunch counter to vote. Meanwhile, Republicans that had started off rich from the Industrial Revolution, they became even richer, rich enough to buy elections, give cause for the term robber barons to be invented, and use the banking industry like their personal piggy banks when they went to play at their favorite casino on Wall Street. To be honest, well, Republicans haven't really changed much. During the 50 years or more that they played fast and loose after Appomattox, they presented themselves as paragons of society and supported prohibition against alcohol, which was the government's sole source of revenue. That's right, before Prohibition, there were no income taxes. The Republican Party was forced to invent income taxes after alcohol became illegal, and they passed the Volstead Act to score a few more political brownie points. The Volstead Act defined alcohol as including everything, even beer and wine. It outlawed the manufacture, distribution, transportation, purchase, sale, or even possession of alcohol to anyone, by anyone, or any organization, unless, of course, you were a doctor prescribing it for your patients. Doctors wound up getting a lot of new patients. But anybody else would be in violation and go to prison and pay a heavy fine. That meant that manufacturers of beer barrels went out of business. Grape farmers saw their crops turned all but worthless. Then came the crash of '29, and Republicans, they didn't have a clue what to do to fix the mess they'd made. Only one man did. A man you probably never heard of. His name was Marriner Eccles. Mr. Eccles had invented inherited a small business when his father died at the turn of the century. He took it over when he was 10 years old and turned it into a huge concern with farms, factories, grocery and hardware stores, and 28 banks. By the time he was 22, he was a millionaire. He was, not to put too fine a point on it, a genius. And when I say he was a millionaire, those were 1920s dollars. Think of it. Imagine starting off taking over a small business from your dead father when you're 10 years old and becoming what would be the equivalent of a billionaire when you're in your early 20s. He believed that the secret to his success was hard work and perseverance. Getting anywhere. So he studied the issue. Franklin Roosevelt, meanwhile, managed to win the election for his first term of office as president by pointing out that beer and wine should be made legal again, if for no other reason to put people back to work. He came out in favor of repealing the Volstead Act. Hoover remained a strong supporter of prohibition and strongly opposed repealing the act for any reason, even if it meant putting people back to work. People started calling homeless camps Hooverville, a name that stuck in the public memory so much that a 1960s sitcom called Green Acres was set in the mythical town of Hooterville. Roosevelt won, of course, by an overwhelming majority. I did mention Marriner Eccles, didn't I? Oh yeah, he had the answers. In a nutshell, his answers boiled down to these. Government should use regulations to restrict banks from using mortgage and savings account to gamble on the stock market. He told Congress and later Roosevelt that government's job was to tax the wealthy at a rate sufficient to take care of its annual expenses, the needs of its infrastructure, the sick and elderly, and to set aside